twins. One likes to go just to be in their face, and the other
Yeah,
one's like.
All right, we're gonna get started. Welcome, everyone. I know that like people will probably come in a little bit later. There's Chick-fil-A if you want Chick-fil-A, and we're just really grateful for Sean and Jenny for coming with us today. We're really excited. So Professor Hopwood has an unusual legal career, and I actually want you to kind of introduce yourself a little bit later and talk about it. But yeah, so before he came to law school, he'll kind of narrate a little bit about his journey into law school. And that included U.S. Supreme Court granting 2 petitions of cert, which he prepared. Sean's research and teaching interests include criminal law and procedure, civil rights, and constitutional rights of prisoners. He received a JD from a Gates Public Service Law Scholar from the University of Washington Law School. And he served as a clerk for Judge Janice Rogers Brown of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District Columbia Circuit. And his legal scholarship has been published in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties, Fordham, and Washington Law Reviews, as well as the American Criminal Law Review and Georgetown Law Journal's Annual Review of Criminal Procedure. Professor Hopwood, you guys just give me a round of applause. Professor Roberts is coming to us from AUWCL. Thank you for joining us. She's a nationally recognized criminal justice expert. She frequently speaks to the media, including a number of interviews about the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd on MSNBC, CBS News. She has written numerous articles on topics including misdemeanors and plea bargaining, and is the co-author of the treatise on collateral consequences of criminal convictions. Her work has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, in addition to dozens of lower federal and state courts, and has won several law school and university awards. Professor Roberts won the law school's Excellence in Teaching Award in the 2019 to 2020 year. So we're excited to have her, and we're excited to just discuss today criminal justice reform. Thank you.
Well, I will start off and give you a little bit of background of what he was talking about. So I've given an introduction to the President of the United States, members of Congress, law schools, big organizations, room full of prosecutors, and my intro goes something like this. My name is Sean Hopwood. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal. And the reason why I like to start that off with, it first makes you wonder, what is he talking about? And second, what I try to get across to people is that character is not static, and even people that make big mistakes can turn it around, and that is an important value in this country, and it's one of the reasons why I am such an advocate for second chances within our criminal justice system. So my foray into the law began with breaking it. In 1999, I stood before a federal district court judge with rather shaky legs, as I was sentenced to 12 years and 3 months in federal prison for my role in robbing 5 banks. I told Judge Cuff that day that I would turn my life around and he would not see me again. Judge Cuff said that he didn't believe a word I said. He said Hopwood was a punk, all mouth and nothing else, and I wouldn't have bet all the farm or all the animals that he would make a productive citizen. Judge Cuff later wrote, 15 years later, was that what Sean showed me, and these are his words, not mine, is that my sentencing instincts suck, and that I was wrong about Sean. And I do a lot of work with judges today, trying to explain to them why we're not very good at predicting who has the power to turn things around and who doesn't. And so one of the reasons why I come to a lot of FedSoc talks is I talk about the current state of our criminal justice system. I find it fundamentally incompatible that we claim to be the land of liberty on one hand, and on the other, we know that we incarcerate our own citizens at a greater rate than almost any other country on the planet. I don't think those two things are consistent with each other. And if I thought locking up as many people as we do, for as long as we do, made us safer, I'd probably still be up here arguing it's too much punishment and it's unjust. But it turns out that the more and more I study the criminal justice system, the more I come to conclusions that locking up over 2 million people actually is counterproductive. It makes us less safe. And a lot of times it does not get at the root causes of why people commit crimes. What do I mean by that? I want to give you an example. So I work with the Policing for Tomorrow program at Georgetown. police officer told me a story that always resonated with me. Pulls somebody over, runs their record, finds out this person has been arrested 14 times for driving without a license. He asked the guy as he's arresting him, like, do you like getting arrested? Why would you want to keep doing this? Why wouldn't you just go get your license? And the man breaks down and starts crying and says he can't read. And part of the reason why he can't get a license is he's illiterate. And locking that person up for the 15th time, needless to say, is not going to get at the root cause of why that person was committing that crime. Oftentimes, that's what our criminal justice system does. We take people off the streets, but the great irony of our American criminal justice system is the longer someone spends in corrections, the less likely they are to come out and be law-abiding, successful citizens. And it's not hard to understand why. Prison is not generally the place for personal growth. Most prisons are incredibly violent. They're incredibly dangerous. Food's not very good. And you're away from everyone that you know and love and care about, and you have had your liberty taken away. And I tell you that most prisons, maybe not so much in the last 10 years as we've had criminal justice reform, but most prisons for the longest did not care about rehabilitating people. It was about punishment only and warehousing people. And it seems to me, if you're going to lock up over 2 million people, and you know that 95% of people that we send to prison are one day going to be released, isn't it incumbent upon us that when they come out, they're rehabilitated and they come out better off, not worse? Serves no one for people to go to prison, become better criminals in prison, get out, commit new offenses, re-victimize people, and then we have to pay for the public defender, prosecutor, and judge, and for them to be reincarcerated. It also doesn't take into consideration the social costs. When we do sentence people to prison, we generally think, well, it's only punishing them. That is so not true. Most of the men that I served time with had spouses and children. And we know, looking at social science data, that children that have an incarcerated parent much more likely to have mental health issues, substance abuse issues, behavioral issues, much more likely to go to prison themselves. When I got to the federal prison, I met a group of people in a row of cells. They called themselves neighbors. They were neighbors because they were all in two-man cells next to each other. They were also neighbors because they were all in the same neighborhood in Milwaukee and had all gotten caught up on a drug charge with conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. They'd all received 20-year mandatory minimum sentences. And when I got there, they were about halfway done with their sentence. And when I got ready to leave, they were getting ready to leave. And you thought it would have been a joyous occasion. Except for the problem that those last couple of years, their sons started coming into the prison system. You take all of the fathers out of a neighborhood, and what happens is you have intergenerational cycles of violence and crime and prison. And that is something no one can want. Again, it doesn't serve us very well to do that to entire communities. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what our criminal justice system has done wrong. And I'll give you a couple things. One is we criminalize way too much conduct. So just on the federal side, which is usually where I spend my focus, there are over 5,000 federal criminal laws. I say this half jokingly, half serious. You have all broken federal law at some point in your life and don't even know it.
And state.
And state law. And that just counts statutes. There are over 300,000 federal regulations that administrative agencies have written that carry criminal penalties, that Congress didn't even create. Administrative agencies created basically criminal laws that you can serve up to 6 months in jail. Most Americans have no idea these exist. I'll give you some example. If you sold something on eBay or Craigslist and omitted, what was wrong with whatever product you were trying to sell, you committed wire fraud. There is a statute for those Second Amendment lovers in the room. There is a statute that says anyone that has ever used or abused a drug on the Controlled Substance Act list cannot possess a firearm. Now think about all of the states that have legalized marijuana and the people that hunt that both smoke marijuana and use guns. It's all illegal. They could go to prison for up to 10 years. And I have pictures of President Bush, Second Bush, President Obama, and President Clinton have all admitted to using drugs in the past and have all possessed firearms. they could all go to prison for that. And so there are so many criminal laws out there that most Americans have no idea that you're breaking criminal law all the time. Sometimes for things as simple as, a guy pours some fertilizer in his backyard. The fertilizer then drips into a drainage system and he's violated the Clean Water Act. Never used to do that. So we've created way too many criminal laws. Then when we do charge people, we have all of these pieces of discretion. Police, whether or not they arrest or let someone go on a citation. Prosecutors, what charges they decide to bring. Judges, when someone is convicted, have huge discretion how to set the sentence. And as you can imagine, because all of these people in the system are fallible human beings, they bring their baggage with them. And oftentimes what happens is the law is not applied equally, and the rule of law, to me, it does not seem like a good way to run a criminal justice system, to criminalize everything and then let prosecutors decide what's so unreasonable that they're going to charge you in a particular jurisdiction. That is a scary system of justice. If we could all break the law all the time, but we're just fortunate enough that the U.S. Attorney's Office in this district does not want to prioritize the crimes that we broke and actually enforce those laws. And so overcriminalization is one thing. Another thing is discretion and the law not being applied equally. Third is we sentence people to longer and for more crimes than most other places in the world. And again, if I thought that made us safer, I would tell you it's still unjust to send our fellow citizens to prison, sometimes for as long as we do, especially for nonviolent offenses. But it also turns out that you're going to make it more likely that that person's never going to get out and live a law-abiding, successful life. Once someone has a felony conviction, they are subject to thousands of collateral consequences. We legally discriminate against in housing, employment, some states voting right. If I lived in Virginia, even though I've been to the White House 8 times, to the Supreme Court many times, and met with members of Congress, I couldn't vote in that state, even now. And so we have all these collateral consequences that make it hard for people once they have served their time and their punishment to get out and get a second chance. And that's what we want, because we want people to get out and recognize they are being given a second chance. They have served their sentence and move on with their lives. It's really difficult this day and age too in the Google era. 20, 30 years ago, if you went to prison, you didn't really have to tell anybody else once you got out. No one would really know unless they did a detailed background search, and most companies did not. Today, even if someone is given a pardon by the president, Google's never going to forget the crimes they committed. And so it's going to be on the internet forever. And that's one of the things that when people get out and don't feel like they get a second chance, where they feel like they're relegated to the lower rungs of society forever, that's a lot of times when they decide to commit new crimes. And again, I think if most Americans were put to the choice where I see a lot of people are who come out of prison, they were put to the choice between homelessness and crime. I think a lot of Americans would choose crime. Few people choose homelessness unless you have some sort of mental illness. Most of the people that I met in prison wanted to come out and not commit new offenses. So why is it I support criminal justice reform? Again, I think conservatives and libertarians care a great deal about these big federal bureaucracies, but somehow they leave out that U.S. attorneys' offices are federal bureaucracies. Administrative agencies that create all these regulations that carry criminal penalties are bureaucracies. And they're not always responsive to the democratic will of the people. I think you can see that now with drug policy. I mean, American people have spoken pretty loudly, at least on marijuana policy, and saying that, listen, we know it's not free of consequences. People who use marijuana, there are bad things can happen for people that use it, but we would rather have those things occur than take people and arrest them and slap felony convictions on them and incarcerate them for something that is less harmful than alcohol, which everybody freely uses and nobody thinks twice about. Most large number of states have both said marijuana medical is legal and now recreational, and yet you look at the polling data, it's almost 70% of Americans, and yet we can't get the U.S. Congress to change policy on that. And so a lot of what we're doing in the criminal justice system is doing things that in any other context, conservative and libertarian folks would be very upset about. And I think the reason why we don't, as conservative and libertarians, spend enough time focusing on this is we generally think that law enforcement's going to make us safer. And I'm telling you, that's not true. And a lot of our criminal justice practices are not based on how human beings behave. I'll give you just one example. Deterrence. This idea that, and I talk to judges about this all the time. Judge will say, Sean, sometimes I got to make an example out of someone. Sometimes I have to give somebody a 20-year sentence to deter everyone else. And I'm like, Judge, who do you think's paying attention to your sentencing practices in the day of Netflix and HBO Max and Paramount Plus? No one. They don't even know what things are illegal, let alone what the punishments are. The thought that someone would be deterred by something they're not even aware of, I just don't think that exists. In 11 years in federal prison, I never met a single person who knew how much time they faced. This idea that we're going to sentence someone to a long period of time to deter everyone else, it's a fairy tale. I never heard of anyone who decided, I can't decide whether I'm going to sell crack or powder cocaine. Let me go look in the U.S. code. And then let me go to the U.S. sentencing guidelines and figure out which one's going to get me in more time. And then I'm going to make my decision. No, people are deterred by whether or not they're going to get caught. They're not deterred by the long-term consequences. Most of the crime in this country is committed by young men 18 to 25. Deterrence theory posits that they're going to act rationally in response to these things. Needless to say, many young men, myself included, did not act rationally to most things. And so, some of the things that we do in the criminal justice system just don't match up with how human beings behave. And so, what I want to do is make a more efficient and fair criminal justice system, one that values individual liberty, that says we are not going to send you to prison unless we absolutely have to. I was astonished when I got to prison. I thought prison that's where the worst of the worst go, where the evil people go. And then I got to prison, what I saw was not evil people. In fact, I was shocked at the number of people serving very long sentences for nonviolent offenses. I'm talking life without parole, 30 years, 20 years, 10 years in federal prison for offenses that in most other countries around the world, you wouldn't even serve a day in prison. There are all sorts of ways to hold people accountable. I would like to think that after COVID and the lockdowns, we would recognize that home confinement is a pretty serious punishment. I had some family members who were freaking out because they had to be locked down during COVID. And I'm like, trust me, this lockdown is not nearly as bad as some I've been through. If you got 300 TV channels to pick from and DoorDash to order, trust me, you're going to be okay. So there are all sorts of ways to hold people accountable, and I do. And I'm not the one that thinks, we should let everyone out of prison tomorrow either. There are some folks I met in prison that are truly not remorseful and will have no problem getting out and re-victimizing people. But we're just not good at predicting who that is. And I'll give you one example. A friend of mine, he's a friend now, he's a former client named Adam Clausen. His case always resonated with mine because it was very similar to mine. He's 24 years old. He commits a bunch of robberies of massage parlors in and around Philadelphia. The only difference and he had a gun, no one physically hurt, and the only difference between me and his case is I pled guilty and received 12 years, 3 months. He exercised his constitutional right to a jury trial and received a 213-year sentence. His out date was December 1st, 2185. And Adam had some prior criminal history, and the judge thought that he needed to go away for a very long time. What they couldn't anticipate was that Adam would go on to compile the most remarkable record of rehabilitation I have ever seen. And I was fortunate enough to work with the Trump administration on a bill called the First Step Act, which is both very modest reform in that it only reforms the federal criminal justice system. But on the other hand, it's the best reform bill to come out of Congress in my lifetime, in part because Congress on criminal justice matters has set the bar so low that any sort of reform looks good at this point. And so one of the reforms was to compassionate release, and we filed a motion for Adam and a judge agreed, reduced his sentence by 189 years, and he walked out of federal prison. He now serves his community in Las Vegas with his wife and 18-month-old son, and he goes into Nevada jails and prisons and partners people coming out of the prisons with Las Vegas police officers. Very successful reentry program. And just a couple weeks ago, Adam testified here in Washington, D.C. before the United States Sentencing Commission on the criteria for compassionate release. There's an example of someone who was largely given a life sentence, not because of what he did, but because he exercised his right to a jury trial. I find that incompatible with a constitution that quite clearly really recognizes the jury trial right is the only right that I know that's both in the body of the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. The framers thought it was so important that they doubled up on it. And so locking someone up for life because they exercise a constitutional right seems to me incompatible with the Bill of Rights. And sending someone away that long when we're not certain we need to is just not valuing people's individual liberty. Why wouldn't we try to send them to prison for the least amount of time to rehabilitate them and make sure that they don't get out and commit new offenses? Why would we err on the side of taking people's liberty away for as long as possible? And so there are a lot of issues with the criminal justice system that need to be reformed. And I work on things like the First Step Act, and I work with all members of Congress, both on the right and the left, anybody that wants to do meaningful reform. And, enjoy doing that work and working with policymakers. And with that, I'll quit talking for a while and let Professor Roberts talk.
All right, thanks a lot, Sean. So I kind of figured he was going to focus on the heavy stuff, so I'm going to mostly focus on the lower end of the spectrum, or misdemeanors and expungement, and spend some time talking about that. But let me start first with, I think that the title, or at least what was in your email, was why conservatives and libertarians should support criminal justice reform despite rising crime rates. So I want to just focus on that last few words, rising crime rates. I don't think we're the only nation in the world to be irrational about what we perceive versus what the actual facts show when it comes to crime, or that we're not the only place where one incident can drive an entire sea change. One terrible incident can lead people to have great fear and to act out of fear in ways that has led us to where we are, frankly, as the mass incarceration nation. But it's also not completely true. So yes, crime rates have ticked up in some places, but not others, as my RA, Rachel Keeper, gave me some of the statistics, and you dip into one city, it's up, another city, it's down. Up here in DC, down in New York, but all down since the 1990s by quite a lot. So when we're talking about murders going up, they're going up from historically low rates. And they might go down next year, or they did go down in many, many next years after a 2020 rise in most places. So it's all very local, and it's all not, you can't, it's sort of our natural inclination to read the paper about a homicide or a horrible rape case or a terrible home invasion and be scared and let that fear drive policy. And that's not a good way to write criminal law and to make criminal justice policy. That said, there's kind of an interesting conservative libertarian support for the low-level stuff, and particularly for expungement. And I'm going to start with a story. I was invited, it's been quite a while now, it's probably been like 8-9 years. I was invited to testify in the Pennsylvania state legislature because they were considering an expungement bill. And one of the state senators had seen me speak at an event about expungement and wanted me to come testify. So I went and I testified, and nobody's paying any attention to those of us testifying. There were like 6 or 7 people in the room, and we were doing our thing. And then afterwards, one of the Republican senators, this was a Republican-sponsored bill, and one of the things I said is Maryland's looking at expungement reform. This is expungement is the fastest moving state legislative area. states are scrambling because mass incarceration is one huge problem, but we are a country of mass criminalization. And that's a term that is broader than mass incarceration, and it's very important to remember that we have both issues going on. So 1 in 3 people have a criminal record in the United States of some sort, arrest or conviction record. The vast majority of those are misdemeanors. 80% of cases nationwide are misdemeanors, 13.2 million misdemeanors prosecuted every year in the United States. And that's a very conservative FBI statistics count, which doesn't include municipal stuff and a lot of other things. So it's probably quite a bit higher than that. So that's really how most people are experiencing the criminal legal system in this country. So I was testifying about how Maryland was gonna consider expungement, and how, wow, people can just cross over from Pennsylvania to Maryland to work, and you guys are gonna be out of luck and you're gonna be behind and it's gonna hurt you economically. And that was the only time anyone looked up during the hearing. Except afterwards, one of the senators pulled me aside and said, I'm really interested in this because my son, and I was like, I know what's coming now, I've been arrested for marijuana, and the criminal record was following that state senator's son around. And when it comes home to roost with, Republican lawmakers, and Democratic lawmakers, there's suddenly an eye-opening moment that this is an actual problem affecting someone who I know in my own family or friend circle. And that's certainly the case when it comes to sort of low-level and high-level criminal touches with the criminal system or incarceration. So in the expungement area, if you think about why conservatives and libertarians will agree with expungement legislation, sponsor it, push it, hold clinics, I think it ties into a bunch of sort of strands that are going on here. One is less government, for sure, right? If you might not even agree the government should be in occupational licensing, but if they are, then it's even more government if you're taking criminal records, as Professor Hopwood pointed out, if you're putting that into the mix, the sort of government interference that led to a criminal record, particularly on a very low level case, although a lot of expungement bills are now extending to felonies. So that's one reason conservatives and libertarians are interested in is more government. So let's make it less by just getting rid of these criminal records to the best extent we can. Google's always there. We don't have a right to be forgotten like they do in Europe. We legislate forgetting through expungement. And I think we legislate forgetting through expungement because we are a particularly unforgiving nation, although I do think that's part of the conservative libertarian strand is, or at least the conservative strand is the belief in redemption and second chances. And expungement is absolutely that on a lower level than, say, a Second Chance Act or First Step Act, where you're talking about getting out of prison after many years. This is being able to sort of hide or suppress a criminal record after however many years the legislation says. The other thing I think there's also the realization by all sorts of groups across the board, although conservatives were certainly later to this game, that this is counterproductive. Just in the same way Professor Hopwood's talking about prison and long terms of incarceration, there's not only a rate at which pretty much all the empirical studies would agree it drops off. There's just no public safety being served when you're keeping people over the age of 50. Is there that anecdotal case of one person who might get out and kill someone? Yes, but you have to decide at what cost. Do you hold everyone in forever on that one chance? That's not how we operate. That's anecdotal. It's not the actual overarching statistic, which is.
I bet we could get everybody to quit speeding if we gave a 30-day mandatory minimum stay in jail. But no one would think that that's reasonable.
Yeah. And I actually don't think we'd get people to stop speeding.
Probably not, because most people wouldn't know.
But you're right. I mean, it sort of proves both points, so yes. So there's that strand of the belief in redemption and second chances. And I think for some amongst conservatives and libertarians is also the recognition of racial injustice and racial bias in the criminal legal system. And that's certainly been part of the rhetoric around why this is important for this country at this time, I think, again, from all sides. That's sort of take one on the conservative and libertarian approach, which is, all of these different reasons make sense to support things like a First Step Back, compassionate release, expungement, decriminalizing or legalizing, which are two different things, marijuana and other low-level stuff, progressive prosecutors who publish memos that say we're going to decline to prosecute these categories of cases, and there's sometimes conservative support for that, right? All of the reasons that I'm talking about. It's not working to lower crime. It's sort of in opposition to the belief in redemption. It's prohibitively expensive, which I haven't talked about, but that's certainly a concern. And it's infected with racial bias. There's another take on conservative and libertarian support for criminal legal system reform, and it's more nefarious, and it's not in complete tension with some of those others, because I think lots of people have good and other intentions mixed together in how they approach policy issues. And this one is the financial benefits that can come from e-monitoring and rehabilitative programs. There's a lot of money out there. And I think some of the very groups that have some of the groups that have funded Right on Crime and other approaches from the right, smart on crime approaches, used to be very tied up, and maybe still are, in private prisons and the profit that was to be made off that. Well, it turns out there wasn't a lot of profit to be made off that. And so a lot of them have moved into the space of looking for funding from e-monitoring and from rehabilitative programs that are linked to the criminal legal system. And so that's a little more nefarious. I think anytime there's profit involved in the misery of, taking away people's liberty, and e-monitoring does do that. A lot of people, anyone would take it almost over prison. I think we could agree on that, but that doesn't mean it's a positive development. But anytime there's money in it, I think we have to pause and think. So that's sort of another take on all of this. I'll wait for time. I'm gonna stop talking, and hopefully there's some questions and we can talk to each other.
One other thing raised by this, I would think conservatives and libertarians would very much want expungement, because it would get folks who've been in the criminal justice system back into work.
Oh, absolutely. If
Back into
I
work.
didn't say
Yeah.
that, I probably missed the main point
And
there.
that is something that I think everybody wants.
Yeah.
But I do agree with the profit motive too. And, it's been interesting to see finally the almost universal agreement that private prisons have not been very good. Although I tell you on the things that I care most about, those private prisons don't even make my top 10 list anymore.
Because they're not really,
They're not,
just aren't that many.
there just aren't that many, and they only represent 8% of the people who are incarcerated in the country.
Yeah, I agree, it's a bit of a red herring. And yeah, if I didn't say the biggest reason for expungement across the board is it puts people back into the workplace. And it gives people opportunities, educational opportunities that might otherwise have, had barriers. And it gives people housing opportunities where there might have been barriers with limitations. So those are all reasons that sort of across the board people should and often do join together to support expungement.
I forgot to address the rising crime rate myself, and here's what I'll say about that is, as Professor Roberts notes, some cities it's going up. For some crimes, some cities it's going down. We're still at historic lows. I do not think criminal justice reform that we have gotten impacted the crime rate at all. If you look at the data on what impacts the crime rate, the state of the economy is the number one factor. When the economy is doing well, crime goes down. The economy is doing badly, crime goes up. Now, why do you think we have some rising crime rates in some big cities, and we have homicide and domestic violence have gone up? Is it because things like the First Step Act, which released a few thousand federal prisoners early from prison? Or is it the fact that we had a global pandemic, people were living on top of each other, and we had much limited economic opportunities for people.
And young people weren't in school or.
Yes, I think I know the answer for myself, but I think that's why we saw a rise in crime. And I do not think, you look at the crime rates and incarceration rates, us in Canada, we have been in simpatico for like 30, 40 years. The only difference is Canada locks up a fraction of the people that we do. You look at states like Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, all of these states, and California, have both reduced their prison population in the last 10 years, like closed prisons, significantly reduced prison population, and watch crime go down in those states. And so that leads me to believe that we do not need to incarcerate this many people to keep us safe, and that there are many, many other factors that are driving the crime rate. And it is not based on the number of people that we incarcerate.
Yeah, I'm gonna add a statistic, which was interesting to read, so thanks for sending me all the statistics on Oklahoma. So it was the #1 incarceration rate state in the US, and if it was its own country, it would be one of the highest in the world. It's #3 now, despite going down 20% in incarceration rates. And it was voters, very conservative voters, who voted in a series of initiatives that then led to a series of legislation that led to this reduction, mostly due to reclassifying simple possession of drugs, which was a felony, to misdemeanors, and low-level theft, which was a felony, to misdemeanors. So hundreds of people were released who were serving very long sentences. You get a 20% reduction in the prison population. At the same time, you get 4% recidivism rates of the hundreds and hundreds of people who were released. And I couldn't find what that recidivism was for, but if it's consistent with the study of people who were released, who were 55 or older after committing homicides, the tiny amount of recidivism was mostly homelessness, disorderly conduct type crimes, things related to poverty. Their overall recidivism rate in the state was down 19%, while their incarceration rate was down 20%. So that's just a, very stark example of how you can ratchet down pretty severely incarceration rates without, while actually having a public safety benefit, let alone making things worse.
Our overcriminalization has also just led to, I think, a lot of Americans viewing criminal law as having less moral force. Why do I say that? Well, it used to be recognized that rape, robbery, murder, assault, fraud, these were all, everybody realizes these are wrong and should be punished accordingly. But when you start talking about 4,000 other things that we equate to those things as being wrong, many of which most Americans wouldn't agree that should be illegal, the criminal law loses its moral force. People, I think if you tell people today that they could be, if they had a bottle of alcohol in their bag, the police could come up, search them, put them in handcuffs, strip search them, take them to jail, potentially keep them in jail for months, they would say that is completely unfair. Well, I think a lot of folks would say that in these states that have legalized marijuana, that the police can do the exact same thing. And so criminal law starts to look like, well, we just make things illegal to make things illegal. Listen, if we were going to criminalize the biggest killer in America, it'd be high fructose corn syrup. That's where we were drawing the line based on public safety. That's where we would draw the line. And so I think a lot of Americans just look at our criminal law and say, why are we made one thing legal and the other thing illegal? And it doesn't make any sense. And because of that, they just don't follow the law. In the same way that half the students at Georgetown faculty don't like how the light situation is outside the law school and jaywalk. Because they think that law's stupid and they should just get to walk across the street because there's no cars coming.
And if you're in Atlanta, you might get locked up for that.
That's right, but you're in Atlanta, you
Very high rate of.
You could get locked up for that. And so people see those inequities and they just don't think that the criminal law is sane policy these days. Something else you said that we legislate on the bad anecdote. When people think about criminal law, they think about Larry Nassar, R. Kelly. They don't think about the millions of people who are cycled through the criminal justice system that we treat unfairly every day, but that nobody sees. And you're right, it's only when it personally impacts them. Jared Kushner would have never been involved with criminal justice reform had his dad not gone to prison for a year. President Trump would not have signed the First Step Act if he hadn't seen some of the criminal justice system and was not worried about it with his family. Those are things that are accurate. The criminal justice system's gotten so big that so many more Americans have recognized the unfairness of it, and that's one of the reasons why I think we've started to see some reforms. As with anything, though, those reforms now are all up for re-examination because of rising homicide rates in a few cities. And again, I don't think criminal justice caused that. Criminal justice reform did not cause that. I think COVID and this feeling like the criminal laws aren't being enforced fairly. And then, of course, all of the cell phone cameras who have captured law enforcement doing things they shouldn't have been doing. I think all of that has led to the rise in crime for some crimes in some cities. With that, we should take some questions.
I want to focus on the expungement aspect. So there's two kind of main arguments. The first is a second chance. The second is the economic argument that puts people in the workforce. But when a government expunges someone, it seems like they might have a checklist, a one-size-fits-all. You met this, you're rehabilitated, great, you're expunged. But if you look at the reputational arguments and the workforce argument, if I'm a private business and I run out of non-criminals to hire, there's really nothing keeping me from hiring people who have criminal records. And I can go ahead and see if they're a right fit for my job. Despite the previous record, I can do reference checks, the ones they gave me, the ones that they may have not given me. I can do interviews, etc. So why is it good for the government to decide that this should not be an issue of public record compared to a private individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is a lot of these expungements are of things that are no longer crimes. So I think we can all see the fairness in the argument that if you're convicted of something that hasn't been a crime, why should somebody have a sodomy conviction that you can go look up on their record, right? And make a decision about that with all the biases that but the employer brings to the table, right? That's one part of it. Marijuana, obviously, huge area of expungement, right? There's just a lot of agreement amongst Americans across the board that this should not be dealt with or any part of the criminal legal system, yet there are people saddled with old records that can now get expunged. So that's just a fairness issue for things that are no longer crimes. Employers can do that, absolutely. There are a lot of studies showing they're spectacularly bad at doing it, even if they say they want to do it. People just have too many biases, and they're just not as good at giving people second chances as they think they would be. And so that's why I said earlier, we're not a particularly forgiving nation, and so we legislate forgetting. And I think that's why.
And I think when the government says, listen, you serve your sentence, and then a certain period of time, you can have that expunged, it incentivizes people to do the right things. And it tells employers, listen, once we've expunged someone's record, you shouldn't hold it against them. And so I think it encourages employers to do it. Honestly, though, we need both. We need private employers to say, we know people who have criminal histories, we're going to hire them anyway. And we need government expunging that, because a lot of those crimes were things that we could all be found guilty of. And that should not drive someone's employment history for the rest of their life. Listen, no one, if you just sit and think about the worst thing you've ever done that no one knows about, whatever that is, you would not want that to be front and center on a t-shirt on you for the rest of your life and to be judged by that every day and to have every potential employer decide whether or not to hire you on the basis of that. And so, when we've done that in the past, what it's led to is very high recidivism rates, because people get out of prison, they can't get a new job, they can't get a job because the employer sees a criminal history, and then they end up in crime. And that we need to prioritize getting people back to work, however we need to. And I think it requires both expungement and just affirmatively asking groups. Anybody know who one of the biggest companies was that started second chance hiring?
Walmart?
before even Walmart. The Cokes was one of the first big companies to prioritize second chance hiring. I'm not certain they do it great, but again, they ended up valuing hiring people and providing second chances. And I feel like if we could get more businesses and corporations on board with that, we would have a better
They're more on
criminal
board
justice
because they
system.
have to be, because they don't have people to hire. I think there were a bunch of other hands. Patrick.
Yeah, I was curious, with the First Step Act, Professor, like you had said, 4 or 5 years ago, it seemed like there was a really strong bipartisanship on this stuff. Cory Booker and Chuck Grassley, talking about the same thing. Doesn't happen too often. It seems like it's kind of gone away. I think Trump maybe even said, like, I wouldn't have signed the First Step Act, again. Or I don't know if Republicans regret it, and maybe it has something to do with some of these rates that they're seeing and concerned about the politics of it. But what do you foresee as the future, like in the near term, as far as whether we can see a second Step Act?
It's depressing. It's depressing. Members of the Senate that I spent a lot of time convincing on the Republican side to vote for the First Step Act would not vote for it today. And I don't think it's because it's good policy. I think because they're trying to win elections. And when they had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they weren't quite as worried about, they were more focused on the policy and not the politics. But both sides have been bad on the politics. For a long time in the 90s, it was a one-way ratchet. Republicans and Democrats would try to war on who could be tougher on crime. President Biden, when he was in the Senate, was one of the worst folks on that issue. And just this week, you're seeing him, he's going to sign a bill that basically gets rid of the DC rewrite of the criminal statutes, even though I tell you that bill is everybody's on it about it's going to lower the penalties for carjacking. It lowers the statutory max. Judges in DC aren't given the statutory max anyways. It was not going to impact sentencing whatsoever because judges weren't doing that, but yet the politics of it, even now President Biden is going to sign that bill and a bunch of Democrats voted for it, even though it's bad policy. And so the politics of this is very tough because fear-mongering gets people to vote better than saying, better than a more positive